We're in Genesis chapter 41. We're going to be in verse, let me see what it is here. I think it's 14. Yes, verse number 14. Oh, yes, thank you for reminding me. We're taking up donations, funds for Christmas for the missionaries. We as a class said that we would do $250, so if you have anything to give, please see Elizabeth. She'll give it to Miss Pam. Either way. Genesis 41. Starting in verse number 14. Where we left off last week is that Joseph had been in prison. He had asked the butler to remember him when the butler was released. The butler forgot about him for 2 years. And I can't even fathom what my feelings would have been had I been Joseph. I mean, here he was hoping to get out, and he's got 2 more years to go. And so he forgot about him for 2 years. Finally, he remembers him when Pharaoh has a dream of his own, needs interpretation. And so that's kind of where we're starting off at in verse number 14. And Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, and he talks about his dream. We're going to stop right there. The historian Herodotus has written in his writings that the Egyptians were what I would term clean freaks. They were absolutely crazy about everything was very clean. A beard was out of the question. I mean, the Egyptians just wouldn't have beards. They typically shaved their head. They had no beard. They were very, very, what's the word I want to use? Enamored with cleanness. I mean, they were just really, really clean freaks. And so here's Joseph. He's being called out to meet with Pharaoh. I mean, he's the most important, most powerful man in the entire world. And he's going to see this guy who's not only is he not an Egyptian, he's a Hebrew, he's a slave, and he's in prison, and he's got to go see the most powerful man in the whole world. Change of clothes is in order, a good shave is in order, okay? He's on his way to go in and see him. So this is kind of the picture where it's at. Pharaoh says in verse number 15, Pharaoh says he dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. Boy, if there was ever an opening for a self-promoter, this would be the place. Oh yeah, I got the power. It's all in me. But he doesn't do that. I want you to note something here. Verse number 16, which we just read, it is not in me. Look at verse number 25, the end of it. God hath showed Pharaoh a dream, and he is about to do. Verse number 28, what God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Verse number 32. The thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Joseph gives all the credit to God. He could have taken credit himself. He could have said, yes, I have the power to do this, and oh, by the way, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you my freedom. It's going to cost you power. It's going to cost you money. You know, you're going to have to give me all that. He doesn't do any of that. He gives all the credit and all the glory to God. We got to remember that as human beings, that whatever we have power to do, we have power to do because God has given us the ability to do so. The very breath that we breathe, the very fact that we can think, the very fact that we can actually be here, all that's due to God's mercy and His grace. And so, rather than take all the credit, He's able to pass it on. I found something very interesting. It was actually pointed out in a commentary that I was reading. When Joseph is speaking to the Egyptians about God, he uses the word Elohim. Elohim is a Hebrew word that means the Almighty. It's a Hebrew word that means the Creator. When he's speaking to the Egyptians, he calls God the Creator, the Almighty One. When he's speaking about God speaking to himself, he uses the term Jehovah. Jehovah is the covenant name. A lot of critics, Bible critics, have used this particular point as proof that the Bible's not really true, that there's multiple sources feeding into the Bible, and so they use this as a proof text. What they don't understand is there is scriptural significance in the two different terms. You see, the Egyptians didn't know God as God. They knew him maybe as creator, or whoever they thought the creator was, but he wasn't Lord. Is that clear? There's a lot of people today who claim that they know of God, but they don't know God. And there's a very big difference there. He can be your creator and not be your Lord. And that's the situation here. Okay. Verse number 17. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-flavored, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored, and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored did eat up the first 7 fat kine, and yet and when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them. I'm having a hard time here. But they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke. So he's talking about this dream. He's rehearsing the dream with Joseph. Joseph's the one who's going to do the interpretation. He's going to be God's tool to take a message to Pharaoh. And so he's rehearsing the dream. This whole dream sequence here is full of symbolism, full of significance. When you think of Egypt, what do you think about? What's one of the first things you think about? I think about the Nile. Think about the pyramids, but I also think about the Nile, right? Egypt is known for the Nile River. So it's interesting here that the kine, the word kine, we don't use that word kine today. Kine means cattle. What is interesting here is the river represents Egypt. The kine come up out of the river. Cattle. We talked about this last week. Where did the cattle come from? What's the significance of cattle? Well, the goddess Isis was known by a symbol of a cow. That was her symbol of deity, was she was the cow goddess. And her husband, Osiris, was written in the Egyptian Book of the Dead as a raging bull. So we've got cow, we've got bull, talking about kine coming up out of the river. So there's a symbolism here. The river represents Egypt, the cow represents the rulers of Egypt, the gods and goddesses of Egypt, okay? He adds to the story. When we read before about what his dream was all about, there were some things that were not mentioned, and the things that he mentioned were this in verse 19, as I never saw before in the land of Egypt for badness. So he's adding to his story. In verse number 21, he says, and when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning, so I awoke. So he's so impressed with this story, it's so preying on his mind, that he adds this emphasis to make sure that Joseph understands what the dream is itself. Okay. Verse number 22. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. We talked about the kine and the cattle representing Egypt itself. Egypt was also known as the granary of the world, okay? Egypt being, I don't know about you, but when I think of Egypt, I think of about a whole bunch of sand, right? I think of like a wasteland. But right along the river, where the river every year, the Nile River would overflow its banks and provide a tremendous amount of water that would actually irrigate the land along the river, and they grew all kind of crops. I mean, they were very well known to be a storehouse of grain. Other nations would go and travel to Egypt. We're going to find that out a little bit later on. They would travel to Egypt to buy grain. So Egypt is symbolized by the cow, symbolized by the river, and symbolized by the grain. Okay? So we've got these 3 different points that are here. It's also interesting to me, do you remember back in the dream of the butler and the baker? There was a threeness that was there. The butler and the baker. The butler talked about 3 branches. The baker talked about 3 baskets upon his head. Those 3 turned out to be days, okay, as interpreted by Joseph. And in fact, they came out to be true, 3 days. Now we have a 7ness. We have 7 kine or 7 cattle. We have 7 ears of corn, and they too will turn out to be a time frame. But they too, as the interpretation goes on, will come out to be years, not days, okay? Okay, verse number 25. Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-flavored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty years blasted with east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. God uses dreams in the Bible to, especially in the book of Genesis, to tell what he's about to do or what he's going to do in the future. There are people today who claim that dreams do the same thing, but I believe God can do that if he wants to. I believe he doesn't do that today. But here he's talking about what God is about to do. He's going to show Pharaoh. There was another king, a very powerful king, a ruler of the entire world, that God used dreams to tell the future, right? That was Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. So it was a situation where God was about to tell what he's going to do. Does God love Egypt? Think about it. Sure, he loves Egypt. He wants to see Egypt saved. He wants to see them come to a saving relationship with him. Is Egypt saved? No, they're still a heathen nation. They're still a pagan nation. But he's going to give them ample warning. God gives us warning. He gives us warning about what the future will be, and it's written in this book. The book of Revelation, a good part of the book of Revelation, is indeed just that. It's warning. It's information. So God's about to tell Pharaoh what he's going to do. He's going to prepare Pharaoh and therefore Egypt for a bad time that's coming. He's also going to use that to support some of the nations that live around Egypt. He's also going to use that to draw a family back together again. Can God get good out of bad? Oh yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, he twists and turns things around. It's interesting to note, Pharaoh said that he told the dream to his magicians. I looked up the word magicians, and it actually has a number of different meanings, but one is a counselor. The other is an occultist, one who can kind of see the future or claims that they can see the future. These people were not stupid people. They were not ignorant people. They were very well educated people. A little bit later on in the story, we find out that what happens is a fellow by the name of Moses stands before the magicians of all Egypt, and Moses is demonstrating some power that God has given him, and the magicians are able to mimic or copy that power and show it forth themselves, and they are not being controlled by God. They're being controlled by Satan himself. And so these are very powerful people. So it's not just the ignorant who believe this, it's the educated who believe this. They should have known better, but they didn't. Sounds familiar?
In this day and time, the smart ones are the ones that don't believe in God.
Yeah.
Science and everything they say.
Exactly. Exactly. And also in the New Testament time frame, Jesus dealt frequently with what? The scribes and the Pharisees and the priests. These were the educated classes of their day. They were not just educated in worldly things, they were supposedly educated in spiritual things. And yet, these educated and spiritual people couldn't see their own Messiah standing right in front of them, even when he did all these miracles. I believe the miracles were there as proof text for who he really was, and they didn't get it. Turn over to I think it's 1 Corinthians. Yes. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Verse number 20. 1 Corinthians 1:20. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For that after the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Go over to chapter 2 while you're right in 1 Corinthians. You're right close by. In verse number 10. But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, yea, the deep things of God. For what man knoweth the things of man, save the spirit of man which is in him? Even so the things of God knoweth no man, but the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit which is of God, that we might know the things which are freely given to us of God. Which things we also speak, not in the words of man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Ghost teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. The world doesn't get it. They don't understand. If you're out there talking to somebody who is a non-believer, someone who's not saved, you're going to find out that they look at you like a Greek, you know? What you're talking to me is foolish. They don't understand. They don't get it because it's spiritually discerned. They don't have a Holy Spirit living within them. You do. You're saved, and by the very fact that you're saved, the Holy Spirit is indwelling within you and teaches you things that he wants you to understand and to know. They don't have that knowledge. So when you talk to them and witness to them, many, many times they'll look at you like you're nuts. You're crazy. Man's wisdom is not God's wisdom. These magicians didn't get it. They couldn't understand. They couldn't interpret. They couldn't tell what the dream was all about because it was a spiritual message from God to Pharaoh about what God was about to do. Right? So remember when you're talking to someone and you get kind of a negative response, they don't have a spirit within them. So we need to make our testimonies, I don't want to say this, a little more straightforward, not in detail. You can't give them a whole lot of detail because they don't get it. They don't understand it. They only understand it by the Holy Spirit who comes to convict them. That's how you got saved. That's how I got saved. I'd heard the message, I can't tell you how many, I heard it when I was in my mama's womb, going to church every day. I didn't get saved till I was 17 years of age. Been in church all my life. Oh, I went to the altar a number of different times and still I didn't get it. Didn't understand what was going on, Brother Richard. I had to be awakened by the Holy Spirit. Not me, I hope. Okay. Verse number 17, he talks about the cattle. 37 through 44, we just talked about that, I believe. Oh, I'm in Corinthians. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Oh. Now the interpretation of the dream in verse number 37 of chapter 41 of the book of Genesis. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. No, I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself. Verse number 25. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine, which came up after them, are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. He says that twice. So we make sure that we get the emphasis there. By the way, double emphasis means pay attention. In the New Testament, we have a lot of double emphasis. Jesus would say, verily, verily. It's kind of like, yo, pay attention to what's being said here. This is an important point. You ever in school go to a seminar, a professor speaking something in class? A good one would make sure that you understood that this particular point is to be noted. I had the opportunity to teach at Sharon Christian School, and there were some teachers there that would teach, and they would make sure that the student body that they had under their control knew this is an important point. It's going to be on the test, you know. So verily, verily, the dream is done twice. Yeah, there's different characters. There's cows and there's corn, but it's the same general theme over and over again, okay? Now what's the general theme? There's going to be 7 good years coming, boon time, and then there's going to be 7 years that are going to be rough, going to be tough sledding. We're going to find out by reading the rest of this chapter, and I'm not going to read all the different verses because we don't have time. But we're going to find out that what is happening here is unfortunately very familiar with today. The Egyptians were well known for being a land of prosperity, a land of plenty. We said that they had the overflowing of the Nile every year, and the overflowing of the Nile would irrigate the land, and they were well known for growing crops, for growing grain. They'd live on the prosperity of the year that they were in. They actually were so prosperous that they sold to other lands around them. They got used to living in a land of plenty. Does that sound familiar? We as a nation are used to living in a land of plenty. God sent them a boon time, but he also followed it up with famine. And if you look at the verse number 30, it says 7 years, verse number 30, and there shall rise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten. Verse number 31, drop down to the last part of the verse. That famine following, for it shall be very grievous. So they're going to have a lot of good time coming, 7 years of plus. But following that 7 years, it's going to get rough. And so God is warning Pharaoh, and he's warning Egypt, and in the process, he's growing his own chosen people, Jacob's family. They don't know it yet, but they're going to find out. Throughout this story, it's bad news. It's good news and it's bad news. It's good news and we're going to have all this wonderful stuff happening, but oh, by the way, you better watch out because the other shoe is going to fall. And so we see in this particular point that what happens is Joseph tells Pharaoh there's problem coming. I was in management when I was in computer sales. Anybody here ever do any managerial positions? Management is a position sometimes where you'll have an employee or a subordinate will come to you and tell you about a problem. And that's good that they tell you about the problem, but they rarely will give you a solution. What's helpful is not just knowing the problem, but knowing the solution as well. Joseph not only gives the problem, but he gives a solution. Now, it's not that Joseph is this wonderful, smart man, although he, I'm sure, is very intelligent. He got all of his intelligence and his smarts from God himself. He's being used as a tool, and he says himself that it's not in me, it's in God. And so he tells the problem that's coming, but he also gives a solution. Here's the solution. The solution is, while you're having 7 years of good, take 20%. A double tithe, if you will. Take 20% and store it away for what's happening. Now, the people may likely have balked at a 20% tax, although today I'd love to have a 20% tax. That'd be wonderful. But they might have balked about a 20% tax, but it was tempered by the fact that they'd have a great increase. So I think the net result was, to the average person, they'd still be better off, even with a 20% tax, they'd still be better off than what they were before. So they're told, Pharaoh's told, here's what you do. You put away 20% of your savings, in savings, and you put it away for the bad times that are coming. My parents went through what we call the Great Depression. They went through a time frame when things got really rough. America, I don't know if you recall this or have studied about this, about the Great Depression at all, but America was a land of plenty right after World War I. They had quite a bit of prosperity and things were going really well, and then all of a sudden the economy starts to fall and things got really rough. Let me give you a personal example. My grandfather, whom I'm named after, my grandfather was a stockbroker in the New York Stock Exchange. His house was within $1,000 of being paid off. He lost his job. The stock market crashed. He lost his job. He lost his house. The family of 3 boys and mom and pop lived in a car and went around to the state parks in Michigan picking cherries to make enough money to live on. They went from prosperity to having a very tough time. Egypt is going to go through this same process. I fear that America will have this same process somewhere along the way. I don't know that for a fact, but we are set up for a fall. So Joseph puts this into play. He tells Pharaoh what's going to happen. He interprets the dream and also gives a solution. Verse number 37. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said unto the servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath shown thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Joseph gives the solution to the problem, but nowhere do we see in the text that as he's given the solution to the problem, he's tooting his own horn. He's just not bent that way. That's not his thing. His thing is to give credit to God. And so, because he doesn't ask for personal favors, by the way, what would a politician do? Would not a politician be seeking personal favors? You know, re-elect me would be one favor. Give me power, give me position, give me money. He doesn't do any of that. I believe that Joseph was telling what's needed. And I believe that he was telling what's needed, not thinking that he would be the one chosen. Think about it. He was a foreigner. He wasn't an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. Not only that, he was in jail. He was in the dungeon. He got pulled out of the dungeon. Not exactly good to be on a resume for a politician. Okay? And then, not only that, but he was a slave. He was the lowest part of society. I don't think that Joseph himself, when he was making this recommendation, thought about, hey, choose me, choose me, choose me. I don't think he had that at all. He tells Pharaoh what's needed. Here's what's important. You need to choose you out a man. This is all got to be controlled by an administrator, someone who knows how to handle things like this. Now, did Joseph have knowledge of management? You bet he did, because he ruled Potiphar's family. He also ruled in the jail. He was the number 2 man in each case. He had knowledge of how it was to be done on a smaller scale. Also, he was young. He was only 30 years of age when all this happened. So he's putting forth this thinking that I don't think that he thought that he himself was going to be the one to take the position of power. But Pharaoh and his lackeys look at him and say, there's the administrator right there. See, if they chose the wrong man to administrate, it would be tyranny. It would be tyrannical. But if they choose the right man, he'd be a leader. He'd lead them out. They didn't need a politician. They had tons of them. They needed somebody who was not a politician to lead them out. You got that one? Exactly. I didn't say that. Okay. Verse number 39. Pharaoh says unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and so wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house. He's going to put Joseph in charge not only of the nation, but over his own personal house. He's going to be Potiphar's number 2. It's going to be Pharaoh's number 2. He's going to take over the personal and national aspects of things. And according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have this day set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Joseph is elevated from the prison to the palace. Boom, just like that. Now, most people would have ego issues with that. they get all puffed up and, oh, boy, am I important, look at this. He's not that way. See, he's been through 13 years of hard time. He's been honed, the rough spots have been chipped away. Think about a building block. The rough spots have been chipped away. He's been in prison. He's been falsely accused. He's been rejected by his own family. I mean, he's been through all these things. It's taken his ego that he had as a 17-year-old that he's going to rule everybody else, and it's whacked it down to where he's now usable of God. Okay? Pharaoh gives him all these accoutrements. He's got to act and dress the part. Okay? He gives him a gold chain. He gives him fine clothes to wear. He gets him ride in a chariot. I mean, these are all, we'd call them perks today. He's got all these perks to help him in his job of ruling the nation. He's got one thing against him. It's his name. Joseph is not an Egyptian name. So what happens is Pharaoh gives him an, to me, unpronounceable name. Okay? He gives him an Egyptian name, and he's going to end up giving him an Egyptian wife. You know, I believe that what he did is he bestowed upon Joseph Egyptian citizenship, social status, political power. I mean, he gave him everything. And it says in here that nobody is able to do anything in the land without Joseph's permission. Only Pharaoh is above him. I mean, he has come quite a ways from the jailhouse. Let's see what else is going on. Verse number 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name whatever, and he gave unto him his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 years of in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered all of the food of the 7 years and were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in cities, and the food of the field which was round about every city laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn and sand as the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. He starts off his process by going and doing a survey. The military would call it reconnaissance. He goes throughout the whole land and he finds out where the strong points are, where the weak points are, and he's also trying to find out, as he's going throughout the whole land, where the central locations are. You see, he sets up storehouses. The military would call it armories, set up different places to store things, to hide things away so that they could be in control. All the croplands that were around a particular storehouse would feed that storehouse. And there was so much that came in the years of plenty that they filled up those storehouses. They even gave off of counting, of keeping records, and the Egyptians were nutcakes about keeping records about everything. So here we see the plenteous, just as God had pronounced. Verse number 49. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much. We already read that. Verse number 50. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, which means to forget, to wipe away. For God said that he hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he named Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. He's fruitful in the land of his affliction. That's important. There was another young man who became fruitful in the land of his affliction. His name was Daniel. Daniel's a very similar story. Daniel was taken from his own land. He was taken captive. He was brought into the land of Babylon. He was elevated with God's power upon him. 53, the 7 years of plenteous, and the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto the Egyptians, go unto Joseph, and what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened up the warehouses and sold unto the Egyptians. Notice he sold unto the Egyptians. It wasn't welfare unto the Egyptians. It was selling unto the Egyptians. Okay? And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt for to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in the land. Here we see several things. Pharaoh had gathered the corn from growing. He took 20%. He stashed it away as a savings, kind of like an IRA, if you want to think about it in that way. And he saves up this money, this food, and then when the hard times come, the first thing that the people do is they go crab to Pharaoh, right? They complain to Pharaoh. Pharaoh passes the buck. Go see Joseph. Joseph, in turn, now he sells the grain that Pharaoh had collected. He takes the taxes that had been collected and he sells the result back to the people. Who's getting rich in this process? Pharaoh's getting rich in this process. He's getting well healed in this process. Not only that, but he's going to not only sell the land sell the corn to the Egyptians, he sells it to all the nations that are around him that come. He's becoming stinky rich. He's becoming very, very wealthy. And this was part of God's plan and God's power. What was to happen? Tough times come. And when tough times come, people learn to tighten their belt. I don't know about you, but we've been through, personally in our family, we've been through some tough times in the past where we had to notch it in a couple of times or two, but God took care of us throughout the whole process. God informed Pharaoh of what he was going to do so that they would be prepared. God will do the same for you, especially because you're his child. Brother Devin, will you close us in prayer?
Dear